The wet weather has caused an explosion of cane toads in Queensland. It's become so bad, some councils are now considering mass culls to get rid of the pests.
This is the story of how Australia's worst ecological disaster began with 102 Rhinella marina toads in a wooden crate, and how one of the continent's smallest native predators turned out to be the unlikely answer that nobody saw coming. In 1935, Australian scientists deliberately released an animal that would kill more native wildlife than almost any other single invasive species on the continent. Over 200 million cane toads now occupy more than 2 million square kilometers of Australia. They've wiped out 90% of some native predator populations. They've resisted every attempt at eradication, and they're still spreading right now at roughly 40 to 60 kilometers per year. But in 2009, a young honours student at the University of Sydney discovered something remarkable. One of Australia's most common native insects, the meat ant, could kill baby cane toads with devastating efficiency. More than 90% mortality in some trials. And the toads couldn't do a thing about it. Their legendary poison, the chemical weapon that had made them virtually indestructible across an entire continent, was completely useless against an insect that doesn't even have the biological machinery the toxin is designed to attack. This is the story of a scientific blunder, an ecological catastrophe, and a tiny predator that offered an unexpected glimpse of hope. To understand why Australia is losing a war against a toad, you need to go back to the sugar fields of colonial Queensland. In 1862, a man named Captain Lewis Hope raised a viable sugarcane crop at his property in Moreton Bay. The sugar industry took root and grew rapidly, but so did its problems. Two species of grayback cane beetle, Dermolepida albahertum, were devastating crops, and by 1900, the situation was dire enough that the government established the Bureau of Sugar Experiment Stations specifically to address the beetle crisis. For decades, conventional methods failed. Then, in 1932, a researcher named Raquel Dexter presented a paper at the International Society of Sugarcane Technologists Congress in Puerto Rico. Her research showed that cane toads largely ate beetle larvae. The toads had already been deployed in Puerto Rico since 1920, and the paper made a compelling case. An Australian entomologist named Arthur Bell visited Hawaii, where the toads had also been introduced, and came back to Queensland convinced he had found the answer. Here's the thing though, nobody studied what the toads might do to Australia's native environment. Nobody even confirmed whether the toads would actually eat the specific beetles, destroying Queensland's sugarcane. They just shipped them in. On June 3, 1935, 102 cane toads left Honolulu, Hawaii. They arrived in Gordonvale, North Queensland on June 22nd. One had died of dehydration during transit. The remaining 101 were bred in captivity, and by August 19th, 2,400 toads were released into sites around Gordonvale. Not everyone was enthusiastic. A prominent entomologist named Walter Wilson Froggatt was deeply alarmed. He wrote prophetically in 1936, "This great toad, immune from enemies, omnivorous in its habits, and breeding all the year round, may become as great a pest as the rabbit or cactus." Froggatt successfully convinced the Federal Health Department to ban further releases. But politics entered the story. In 1936, Prime Minister Joseph Lyons caved to pressure from the Queensland government and the media and rescinded the ban. By March 1937, 62,000 toadlets had been bred in captivity and released across areas around Cairns, Gordonvale, and Innisfail. The toads didn't eat the cane beetles. Let me say that again. The entire reason for their introduction, the one job they were brought to Australia to do, they didn't do it. The beetles lived in the upper stalks of the cane, and the toads stayed on the ground. They barely interacted, but the toads did something else spectacularly well. They bred. A single cane toad can lay 30,000 eggs in a single clutch. They breed year-round in tropical conditions. And they had no natural predators in Australia because their parotid glands contain bufadienolides, a potent cardiac toxin that attacks the sodium-potassium ATPase pump in the hearts of vertebrate predators. Any snake, lizard, crocodile, or marsupial that tried to eat a cane toad typically died. By 1950, just 15 years after their release, the cane toad was officially declared a problem species. But the real horror show was just getting started. The toads marched west, slowly at first, then faster. They colonized most of Queensland's east coast by 1959. They reached the Queensland Northern Territory border in 1984. In March 2001, they entered Kakadu National Park, one of Australia's most ecologically significant protected areas. In February 2009, cane toads crossed the Western Australian border, over 2,000 kilometers from where they were first released 74 years earlier. And they're still going. The straight-line distance between the invasion front in 2009 and the invasion front in 2023 was 577 kilometers. As of 2024, they had completely colonized the northern and central Kimberley bioregions, an area of 240,000 square kilometers. And that's when something genuinely unsettling became clear. The toads are evolving. The ones at the western frontier of their advance have developed longer legs. They move faster. They cover more ground. And roughly 10% of these frontier toads have developed arthritis as a consequence of their larger, faster bodies being pushed beyond their structural limits. The invasion is literally evolving to accelerate. The ecological toll has been staggering. When cane toads arrive in a new area, the death wave follows almost immediately. In some regions, more than 90% of northern quolls died shortly after the toads showed up. Many quoll populations were simply wiped out entirely. Around 90% of adult goannas in affected areas perished. Freshwater crocodile populations plummeted by more than 70% due to lethal ingestion of toxic toads. Blue-tongued skinks suffered similar devastation. These are animals that survived millions of years of evolution on one of the harshest continents on Earth, only to be killed by an animal that a sugar bureau imported because they didn't bother to check if it would eat beetles. The economic damage from invasive species in Australia, including cane toads, has been calculated at $390 billion over the past 6 decades. That's roughly $25 billion a year, and growing. By the early 2000s, the scientific community was essentially out of ideas for stopping the cane toad. Every conventional approach had failed. Trapping was too slow. Poisoning risked native species. Physical barriers were impractical across thousands of kilometers of frontier. And the idea of bringing in another foreign predator was, for obvious reasons, off the table. Australia had already learned that lesson the hardest possible way. Then came Professor Rick Shine. Shine is an evolutionary biologist and ecologist, currently a professor at Macquarie University and emeritus professor at the University of Sydney. In 2005, he created Team Bufo, named after the Latin classification for the cane toad. The team set up shop at the Fog Dam research site near Darwin, right in the path of the advancing toad front. Their goal was simple but ambitious. Understand the toad well enough to find its weaknesses, and Shine had a philosophy that was radically different from previous approaches. As he put it, the ideal way to control toad numbers would be to find a predator that kills and eats toads but leaves native frogs alone. However, bringing in a predator from overseas might have catastrophic consequences, like those that occurred when cane toads themselves were brought in. So, we've explored an alternative approach to see if we could use a native predator. The answer was already under their feet. In 2009, Georgia Wardfear, an honors student working under Shine, published a landmark paper in the journal Functional Ecology. The title said it all: Maladaptive Traits in Invasive Species. In Australia, cane toads are more vulnerable to predatory ants than our native frogs. The meat ant, Iridomyrmex purpureus, is one of Australia's most common and aggressive insect species. Found in almost every state and territory except Tasmania, these ants form massive colonies, forage in enormous numbers, and attack prey with coordinated ferocity. They are, by any measure, one of the dominant invertebrate species on the continent. What Ward Fear discovered was that juvenile cane toads were astonishingly vulnerable to these ants, and for reasons that bordered on poetic justice. You see, native Australian frogs have evolved alongside meat ants for millions of years. When a native frog encounters an ant, it recognizes the danger and leaps away in about 1 second. But cane toads evolved in South America, where there are no large predatory ants of this type. Baby cane toads have no instinct to avoid them. They don't recognize the threat. They don't flee. In fact, juvenile cane toads are active during the day, at exactly the same time and in exactly the same places where meat ants forage. They practically walk into the kill zone. And when an ant does attack, the toad's natural defense, the response that has made it nearly invincible against Australian vertebrates, is to simply sit still and let its toxin do the work. Against a snake or a quoll, this is a death sentence for the predator. Against an ant, it's a death sentence for the toad. Bifadienolides are cardiac glycosides that target the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. They attack the heart. And ants, as one researcher put it with delicious understatement, are heartless. The toxin literally has no target. The ants are completely immune. The numbers from Ward Fear's research were extraordinary. In trials at high ant density, 98% of metamorphed toads encountered at least one ant. 84% were attacked. In some field trials, ants attacked and killed more than 90% of toads near the water's edge within a short period. Over 50% of ant attacks in the field were immediately fatal, and of the toads that initially escaped, 88% died of their injuries within 24 hours. Researchers at Team Bufo then figured out a beautifully simple way to weaponize this dynamic: cat food. A few tablespoons of cat food placed near ponds attracted meat ants in massive numbers, increasing ant densities and therefore toad mortality more than fourfold. Australia's new weapon against its deadliest invader was a tin of Whiskas. The following year, in April 2010, Ward Fear, along with Greg Brown and Rick Shine, published a follow-up study in the Journal of Applied Ecology, confirming the results in controlled field conditions. Ward Fear won a University of Sydney medal for her honors research. The scientific community took notice. But that's where the story takes its most honest and complicated turn. This is the unexpected result that the title promises, and it's not as simple as tiny ants defeat giant invasion. The meat ant strategy works brilliantly against juvenile toads. Metamorphs, the tiny toadlets that have just transformed from tadpoles and are emerging from the water, are defenseless against ant predation. But adult cane toads are too large, too toxic, and too tough for meat ants to threaten. And remember, a single adult female can lay 30,000 eggs in one clutch. The meat ants can devastate the next generation in localized areas, but they cannot stop the continental scale invasion. As one assessment bluntly noted, the impact of meat ants on cane toads can be significant with small numbers of toads, but when you get areas with large numbers, it doesn't seem to make any difference at all. There were also ethical objections. The RSPCA raised concerns that encouraging ants to attack cane toads was inhumane, urging researchers to find methods that don't cause unnecessary pain or distress. And Rick Shine himself has been characteristically honest. He acknowledged, "You'd have to be a desperate optimist to think that we'll ever see the end of cane toads in Australia." So the meat ant discovery was not a silver bullet, but it was something arguably more important. It was proof of concept, proof that native solutions could address invasive problems without repeating the catastrophic cycle of importing yet another foreign species. Proof that understanding an invader's evolutionary blind spots could reveal vulnerabilities invisible to brute force approaches. And the science hasn't stopped. Team Bufo and others have continued developing new tools. As of 2024, commercially available tadpole traps use pheromones extracted from cane toad glands to lure cane toad tadpoles specifically, catching thousands within hours while leaving native tadpoles untouched. Conditioned taste aversion programs are training native predators to avoid eating toads, reducing predator deaths by up to 95% in some areas. And perhaps most remarkably, Shine's team has begun exploring genetic modification using CRISPR-Cas9 technology to create what they call Peter Pan tadpoles, genetically modified toad tadpoles whose ability to metamorphose has been knocked out. These permanent tadpoles are cannibalistic, consuming newly laid eggs, potentially offering a self-sustaining, long-running block to cane toad breeding. Meanwhile, nature itself is adapting. In 2019, researchers discovered that the native Australian water rat had independently learned to kill and eat cane toads by making precise incisions to access the heart and liver while avoiding the toxic skin and glands. These rats adapted their hunting strategy within just 2 years of encountering the toads for the first time. Some snake populations are evolving smaller heads, making them physically unable to swallow the largest and most toxic toads. And in areas where cane toads have been present for decades, many of the predator species that were initially devastated have recovered. Their populations are common again. No Australian species has gone extinct as a direct result of cane toads. Not yet, anyway. The cane toads are predicted to reach the Pilbara bioregion, an ecologically critical area of 178,000 square kilometers in Western Australia, somewhere between 2035 and 2055 under a do-nothing scenario. The invasion continues. The clock is ticking. But the story of the meat ant is ultimately about something larger than ants and toads. It's about the difference between the arrogance of 1935, when scientists imported a foreign species without even checking if it would do what they wanted, and the humility of 2009, when a young researcher looked down at the ground and realized the answer had been there all along, crawling through the dirt of a continent that had been fighting its own battles for 65 million years. Australia didn't need to import a savior. It needed to understand the one it already had.